Another one of the major aspects of the 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties as we've been calling them, was the Harlem Renaissance. So what I want us to keep in mind throughout this presentation is, of course, our guiding question. What was the Harlem Renaissance and how did it impact history? And the Harlem Renaissance especially impacted certain groups in history and certain areas, geographic areas. So let's keep that in mind. So between the 1920s, or 1910 and 1920s, we see the Great Migration. And the Great Migration was this big push of African Americans moving to the north and to those bigger cities. A lot of times they were escaping those sharecropping situations that we talked about earlier. Life in the South was still based a lot on farming and agriculture, and those jobs kind of went away during the Industrial Revolution. So people began to move north into those factories, cities, and areas like that. So by 1920, over 5 million of the nation's 12 million blacks lived in the city. So that's over 40% of the total population of African Americans were living in these urban areas. So the NAACP, which you have heard about before, was an organization that really urged African Americans to protest against their situations, to protest against maybe not having the equal rights and equal pay that a lot of their white counterparts did have. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founding members of the NAACP, and he's going to lead a march of 10,000 black men into New York to protest violence that was going on against the African Americans, things like lynchings. And we'll look into some of those lynchings in class tomorrow, so you can kind of see where that came from. Another one of the big activists for African Americans was Marcus Garvey. And he believed that African Americans should build kind of their own society to separate themselves from everybody else. He started the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He claimed to have over 1 million members during the mid-1920s. And he really spoke out for Black pride, and he wanted African Americans to be economically independent, not to be dependent on these factories and other businesses that were run by white men. He definitely had a very extremist view, but it's important to understand those different views that were going on during this time period. So the majority of the Harlem Renaissance obviously took place in Harlem, New York. It was the largest urban community that was essentially built around that African American culture. The bad sides of that, just like anywhere that you're going to see a mass movement, overcrowding, unemployment, poverty were all issues in Harlem at the time. But it was also a home to a big shift in African American culture. You're going to start to see more and more really famous African American writers, African American artists, music, jazz music is going to come a part of this. So all of this movement to the cities really helped help African Americans to find more of an identity in the United States, especially after Reconstruction and slavery. I mean, keep in mind that this is a short time after that. So it's really kind of neat to see that culture develop. So some of the writers, and the Harlem Renaissance was mostly a writing phenomena. You see lots and lots of African American writers coming out into the mix. These African American artists and writers wanted to show their experience to the world, to let people know what was going on with them. One example is Claude McKay, and he was a poet, and he wrote about a lot of the problems with life in a city like Harlem. Then we have Langston Hughes, and you have heard of Langston Hughes and read some of his poems. He was born in Missouri and was probably one of the best known poets of the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of his poems described the difficult conditions, once again, of being a working class African American during the 1920s. Really looked at what it was like to be poor and to really struggle. And a lot of his poems were put to music, especially jazz and the blues. So you see that today. A lot of our rap stars really start off as poets, and they put their poems to music or to beats, and that's, you know, becomes a big push in music. Same thing happened during the 1920s. Zelenia Hurston is another one. She wrote novels, short stories, and poems. Once again, we see this common theme. She's writing about the lives of poor, unschooled Southern blacks. Okay, she is bringing to light some of the issues of African Americans in the South. And this is a big push in the literary movement. And you still see books today published about that. She focused on the culture of the people, their folkways, their values, like what life was like on the farms. It was a very different culture than your urban African American, but still a very prominent one. Then we're going to look at some of the performers, African American performers. So large followings for the first time in the 1920s. They're going to start to have them. Paul Robeson was one of them. He was the son of a slave. He became a major actor, and his performance in Othello is still considered to be one of the best performances of all time. I mean, he did an amazing job with it. And then these two you should definitely recognize. Louis Armstrong. I think everybody's probably heard of Louis Armstrong, and we're going to listen to some of his music in class tomorrow. Jazz was born in the early 20th century. He was a trumpet player. He's going to join the Creole Jazz Band, and then he's going to really have this amazing career in which he became the most important and influential musician in the history of jazz, and which is why you still recognize his name today. And then we have Duke Ellington, who was a pianist and a composer, somebody who writes music. He led a 10-piece orchestra at the famous Cotton Club, and was known as one of America's greatest composers. So two of probably the most famous people from the Harlem Renaissance right there. And then there was Bessie Smith, and she was a blues singer, perhaps one of the best or most outstanding vocalists of the decade, and we're going to listen to her tomorrow. It's very different from the music that you're used to, but you can really hear how powerful her voice was. She achieved enormous popularity, and by 1927 was the highest paid black artist in the world. So she did very well, obviously. But the main thing that I want you to keep in mind about the Harlem Renaissance is that it was a push to educate all of the United States about the trials and the troubles of African Americans and what they were having to go through post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, during this time period of segregation. It was really a rough time, and you know, while the Roaring '20s was this decade of opulence and spending money and partying, there were a lot of people who were still just trying to get their stories out to the world. So that's what the big basis of the Harlem Renaissance was. So keep that in mind and be prepared for class tomorrow so that we can listen to some of this music and talk about some of these people. And I will see y'all then.